2 envelopes arrived that Tuesday morning. The first one, hand-delivered by Richard Hayes with that familiar smug grin, contained an eviction notice. 30 days to vacate. Bold red letters. He wanted Marcus Williams and his family out, and he didn't care how he did it. But the second envelope, that one would teach Richard the most expensive lesson of his life, because the family he was so eager to remove didn't just live in apartment 4B, they owned the building. They owned the entire complex. They owned everything Richard thought was his empire. Marcus Williams stood in his doorway at 7:30 a.m., his coffee still steaming in his hand, staring at the eviction notice that had been taped to his door. The paper felt cheap between his fingers, but the words were real enough. Violation of lease terms. 30 days to vacate. No exceptions. Behind him, his wife Sarah was getting their 3 children ready for school, her voice gentle but firm as she reminded their youngest to brush her teeth properly. "Daddy, what's that paper?" asked 8-year-old Maya, her backpack slung over one shoulder as she peered around his leg. Marcus folded the notice calmly. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart. Go finish getting ready." But it wasn't nothing. Marcus had been expecting this moment for weeks. The complaints that didn't exist. The maintenance requests that were suddenly urgent violation. The way Richard Hayes, the building manager, had started looking at them differently after that community meeting where Marcus had politely suggested better lighting in the parking lot. It wasn't about the lighting. It was never about the lighting. 20 minutes later, Richard Hayes knocked on their door. He wasn't alone this time. 2 men in cheap suits flanked him, their presence meant to intimidate. Marcus opened the door, his expression neutral, his voice calm. "Mr. Hayes." "Gentlemen." Richard's chest puffed out slightly. He'd been planning this moment for weeks, rehearsing the words in his head. "Mr. Williams, I trust you received the notice. I'm here to discuss your options." "I read it," Marcus replied simply. "Good. Now, I want to be fair about this. If you can vacate by the end of this week instead of waiting the full 30 days, I'm prepared to waive the penalty fees. Consider it a gesture of goodwill." Sarah appeared behind Marcus, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She said nothing, but her presence was steady, calm. The children were at the kitchen table now, backpacks ready, watching their parents with the quiet awareness that children have when they sense something important is happening. "And if we choose to stay the full 30 days, Marcus asked. Richard's smile didn't reach his eye. "Well, that's your right, of course. But I should mention that I'll be conducting daily inspections for the remainder of your time here. Lease compliance, you understand? And any violations found during those inspections will be documented for future reference." The threat was clear. Make our lives miserable until we leave voluntarily. Marcus had seen this playbook before. He'd helped other families navigate it through his work with the housing advocacy group downtown. But he'd never expected to be on the receiving end. "I see," Marcus said quietly. "And these violations you've documented? The ones mentioned in the eviction notice? Could you be more specific?" Richard consulted his clipboard with theatrical precision. Excessive noise complaints from neighbors. Failure to maintain common area responsibility. Unauthorized modifications to the unit. Which neighbors complained about noise? That's confidential information. What common area responsibilities did we fail to maintain? The lease clearly states what unauthorized modifications. The screen door you installed without prior written approval. Marcus nodded slowly. The screen door that I requested permission for in writing 6 months ago. The one you approved via email. I have no record of that approval. "I do." The silence stretched between them. Richard's 2 companions shifted uncomfortably. One of them, clearly hired muscle rather than legal representation, was starting to look like he regretted taking this job. "Regardless," Richard continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, "the decision has been made. You can make this easy, or you can make it difficult, but the outcome will be the same." Marcus looked at his children, still seated at the kitchen table, trying to pretend they weren't listening to every word. Maya's small hands were folded in her lap, her eyes wide. His oldest, 13-year-old David was staring at his cereal bowl, his jaw set in a way that reminded Marcus of himself at that age. "Mr. Hayes," Marcus said finally, I'd like to make a phone call before we continue this conversation. Would that be acceptable? Richard's smile returned, genuine this time. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The begging, the negotiating, the desperate scrambling that he'd seen from other families in this same position. Of course, take all the time you need. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Morrison, Chen and Associates. This is Jennifer. Jennifer, it's Marcus Williams. Is David Morrison available? Marcus, of course. Let me put you right through. Richard's eyebrows raised slightly. A law firm. Even better. Let them waste money on legal fees that wouldn't change anything. He'd done this before. He knew exactly how it would play out. David, Marcus said when the call connected, I need you to prepare some documents for me. The property management files for Riverside Gardens Complex. All of them. And I need you to contact our friends at the Housing Authority. We might have a discrimination case that needs documenting. Of course, came the... Should I also prepare the ownership transfer documents you've been putting off? Marcus glanced at Richard, who was still wearing that confident smirk. Yes, I think it's time to make that official. Richard's smile faltered slightly. Ownership transfer document. What the hell was this tenant talking about? Excellent. I'll have everything ready within the hour. Should I meet you at the complex or at your office? The complex will be fine. Apartment 4B. Perfect. Oh, and Marcus, congratulations on finally making this move. It's been a long time coming. Marcus hung up and looked at Richard, whose expression had shifted from confident to confused to something approaching concern. Everything all right, Mr. Williams? Richard asked, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. Everything's fine. My attorney will be here within the hour to discuss this situation. I hope you don't mind waiting. Richard's mind was racing. Attorney? What kind of tenant had an attorney on speed dial? And what was that about ownership transfer documents? This wasn't how these conversations usually went. Usually, there was crying, begging, promises to do better. Perhaps we should reschedule, Richard said, his voice losing some of its earlier conviction. No need. David Morrison is an excellent attorney. I think you'll find the conversation very educational. Sarah squeezed Marcus's shoulder gently. It was time to get the children to school. As she gathered their backpacks and lunchboxes, she whispered something to each of them. Whatever she said made Maya smile and David straighten his shoulders. We'll be back in 20 minutes, Sarah said to Marcus. Then, looking directly at Richard, she added, I hope you gentlemen will still be here. I'd hate for you to miss what comes next. Richard watched them leave with growing unease. The confidence he'd felt an hour ago was evaporating. These people weren't acting like victims. They weren't acting scared. They were acting like they knew something he didn't. Exactly 18 minutes later, a black BMW pulled into the parking lot. David Morrison stepped out, followed by a woman in a sharp business suit carrying a briefcase that looked like it cost more than Richard made in a month. Morrison was tall, silver-haired, and moved with the kind of quiet authority that came from winning cases that mattered. Richard watched through the window as they approached the building. His two companions, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable, were now openly questioning whether they should leave. Maybe we should come back another time, one of them suggested. No, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. I want to see what kind of game they're trying to play. The knock on the door was professional. Polite, Marcus opened it with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained all morning. David, Catherine, thank you for coming so quickly. Marcus, Morrison replied with a warm smile. Catherine has all the documents you requested. I think it's time we cleared up some confusion. They entered the small apartment, and suddenly the space felt different. Morrison's presence filled the room with an authority that Richard recognized and resented. Catherine, the woman with the expensive briefcase, was already organizing papers on the dining table with surgical precision. Gentlemen, Morrison said, addressing Richard and his companions, I'm David Morrison. I represent Mr. Williams in various business matters. I understand there's been some confusion about his tenancy here. Richard found his voice. There's no confusion. This man is a tenant, and he's being evicted for lease violations. This is a simple landlord-tenant matter. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. I see. And you are? Richard Hayes, building manager. Ah, yes, Mr. Hayes. We've been meaning to speak with you. Morrison accepted a folder from Catherine and opened it with deliberate care. Tell me, Mr. Hayes, how long have you been managing this property? 5 years. And in those 5 years, how many families have you evicted? Richard shifted uncomfortably. I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. I don't keep exact count. Several. 17. Catherine said without looking up from her papers. 17 families in 5 years. Interesting pattern, wouldn't you say? Richard's mouth went dry. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Morrison replied smoothly. I'm simply establishing facts. 17 families. All of them African American. All evicted for what you termed lease violations that somehow never seem to apply to your other tenants. That's coincidence. Morrison smiled. Is it? Because we have documentation suggesting otherwise. Complaints that were fabricated, maintenance requests that were ignored for some tenants and used as violation notices for others. A rather clear pattern of discriminatory practices. Richard's face was flushing red. You can't prove any of that. Actually, Catherine said, finally looking up from her papers, we can. We have testimonies from former tenants. We have email record. We have documentation of every complaint you've filed, every inspection you've conducted, every eviction notice you've issued, and we have security footage. Security footage. Oh yes, Morrison continued. You see, Mr. Hayes, Williams here has been concerned about discriminatory practices in this complex for quite some time. So he installed a comprehensive security system, hidden cameras in the hallways, the lobby, the parking lot. All perfectly legal, of course, since he had the authority to do so. Richard's world was starting to tilt. What authority? More authority. Morrison exchanged a glance with Marcus, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Well, that brings us to the main point of this conversation. Morrison pulled out a thick document bound in blue legal backing. Mr. Hayes, meet Marcus Williams, not just your tenant, your employer. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. What? Marcus Williams is a founding partner of Williams & Associates Property Development, the company that owns Riverside Gardens Complex, the company that employs Pinnacle Property Management, the company that, through a series of management contracts, employs you. Richard's legs gave out. He sank into the nearest chair, staring at Marcus with the expression of pure shock. That's impossible, he whispered. Catherine spread several documents across the table. Ownership papers, management contracts, financial records, all bearing the name Williams & Associates, all signed by Marcus Williams. Mr. Williams has been what you might call a silent partner, Morrison explained. He preferred to let the management company handle day-to-day operations while he focused on other business ventures. But recent events have convinced him that more direct oversight is necessary. Marcus spoke for the first time since the lawyers arrived, his voice quiet but clear. I bought this complex 3 years ago, Mr. Hayes. I've been watching you operate ever since, waiting to see if the reports I was getting about your management style were accurate. Richard was struggling to process the information. You own this place. 51% controlling interest, yes. My partners and I purchased it from the previous owners who were having financial difficulties. We kept the existing management structure in place because we believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. But you live here, in apartment? Marcus nodded. My family and I chose to live here because we wanted to understand the community from the inside. We wanted to know what it felt like to be tenants in our own building. We wanted to see how our employees treated the people they were hired to serve. The implications were crashing over Richard in waves. Every discriminatory comment, every fabricated complaint, every illegal threat, all of it had been directed at his own boss. The eviction notice you served this morning, Morrison continued, was not only completely without merit, it was also your resignation letter. Pinnacle Property Management's contract with Williams & Associates was terminated at 8 a.m. today. Catherine handed Richard an envelope. Your final paycheck and termination paperwork. We've also taken the liberty of documenting your management practices for review by the relevant housing authorities. Richard opened the envelope with shaking hands. The severance check was more generous than he deserved, but the termination letter was brutal in its clinical precision. Discriminatory practices, harassment of tenants, violation of fair housing laws, pattern of racist behavior. I didn't know, Richard said weakly. No, Marcus replied, you didn't know who I was. But you knew exactly what you were doing to the family in apartment 4B, and to the 17 families before us. Morrison gathered his papers with practiced efficiency. Mr. Hayes, I strongly recommend that you seek legal counsel. The federal housing discrimination case we'll be filing next week names you personally, along with Pinnacle Property Management. The security footage we've collected is quite compelling. Richard's 2 companions had already left, slipping out during the legal presentation like smoke in the wind. Richard sat alone in the apartment that he'd tried to force a family to abandon, surrounded by the evidence of his own destruction. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely audible. Marcus looked at the man who had tried to destroy his family's peace, who had fabricated complaints and made illegal threats, who had treated them as less than human simply because of the color of their skin. Now you leave, Marcus said simply. You pack up your office, turn in your keys, and you leave. The new management company starts tomorrow. Richard stood on unsteady legs. And the lawsuit? That proceeds regardless. Too many families have been hurt by your actions for us to simply let it go. But how it proceeds might depend on your cooperation with the investigation. Richard nodded, understanding the implication. He walked to the door, then turned back one last time. For what it's worth, he said, I'm sorry. Marcus studied his face for a long moment. Hayes, I don't think you're sorry for what you did. I think you're sorry you got caught doing it to the wrong person. The apartment was quiet after Richard left. Morrison and Catherine finished packing their documents, shook hands with Marcus, and departed with promises to keep him updated on the legal proceedings. Sarah returned with the children 30 minutes later, their young faces bright with curiosity about the morning's events. Is everything okay, Daddy? Maya asked, climbing onto his lap. Marcus wrapped his arms around his youngest daughter and looked around their small apartment. In a few weeks, they would move to the penthouse unit they'd originally designed for themselves. But for now, this space felt different. Not because anything physical had changed, but because the threat that had hung over it was gone. Everything's okay, sweetheart. We're staying right here as long as we want to. David, his 13-year-old, sat down beside them. Dad, why didn't you just tell him who you were from the beginning? It was a good question, an important question, because, son, I needed to know who he really was. Not how he treats people he thinks are important, but how he treats people he thinks don't matter. That tells you everything you need to know about a person's character. Sarah sat on the arm of the chair, her hand resting on Marcus's shoulder. And what did you learn? Marcus considered the question carefully. I learned that some people see skin color before they see humanity. I learned that power corrupts when it's not checked by accountability. And I learned that sometimes the only way to protect other families is to document the full extent of someone's misconduct. Maya looked up at him with wide eyes. Are you going to help the other families that man was mean to? Yes, baby. We're going to help them. That afternoon, Marcus walked through the complex with fresh eyes, not as a tenant hoping to avoid conflict, but as an owner responsible for creating the kind of community he wanted his children to grow up in. He knocked on doors, introduced himself properly for the first time, and listened to stories that broke his heart. Mrs. Johnson in 2A had been living in fear of eviction for months because she'd complained about a broken air conditioner during a heat wave. The Martinez family in 3C had been charged illegal fees for maintenance requests that were never completed. The elderly Mr. Peterson in 1B had been told his service dog wasn't allowed, despite having proper documentation. Each story added weight to the federal case that Morrison was building. But more importantly, each story reminded Marcus why he'd bought this property in the first place. Not as an investment, but as a community. 2 weeks later, Riverside Gardens complex had new management, new policies, and a new reputation. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about what had happened to Richard Hayes, and applications for vacant units began pouring in from families who had heard they could trust the new ownership. Marcus kept his family in apartment 4B for another 6 months, long enough to ensure the transition was smooth and the new management company understood their expectations. When they finally moved to the penthouse, Maya cried because she would miss the neighbors who had become like extended family. The federal housing discrimination case against Richard Hayes and Pinnacle Property Management settled out of court 18 months later. The financial penalties were substantial, but the policy changes required by the settlement were more important. New training requirements for property managers, regular audits for discriminatory practices, a hotline for tenants to report violations without fear of retaliation. Richard Hayes never worked in property management again. The settlement required him to attend sensitivity training and perform community service, but the real consequence was simpler. His reputation in the industry was destroyed. The network of property managers, who had quietly enabled discriminatory practices for years, suddenly found themselves under scrutiny they'd never faced before. Marcus Williams continued to live at Riverside Gardens Complex, moving between various units to maintain his connection to the community. His children grew up understanding that their father's success came with responsibility, the responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Years later, when Maya was in college studying civil rights law, she would write her senior thesis about the morning a racist landlord tried to evict her family from their own building. She called it "The Power of Patience: How Documenting Discrimination Creates Lasting Change." But on that Tuesday morning, when 2 envelopes arrived and changed Richard Hayes's life forever, Marcus Williams was just a father protecting his family and ensuring that no other family would face the same threats they had endured. He didn't seek revenge. He sought justice. And sometimes, when you're patient enough to document the full extent of someone's misconduct, justice finds a way to serve itself. The story of Riverside Gardens Complex became legendary in housing advocacy circles, not because a wealthy man bought a building, but because he used his position to expose systematic discrimination and create lasting change. And every time Marcus walks through those halls, past the families who now live there without fear, he's reminded that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is simply refusing to let it continue in darkness. Some fights are worth having, some lessons are worth teaching, and some people, like Richard Hayes, learn too late that the person they're trying to destroy might be the very person who holds their future in their hands. The eviction notice that started it all still sits in Marcus's desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that discrimination thrives in silence and dies in the light of accountability. Richard Hayes thought he was evicting just another black family. He ended up evicting himself from a career built on prejudice and protected by silence. And Marcus Williams, he ended up proving that sometimes the best way to fight discrimination is to let discriminators destroy themselves while you document every moment of their downfall. The apartment in 4B is still occupied today. The family living there doesn't know the full story of what happened in that doorway on a Tuesday morning years ago, but they sleep peacefully, knowing they're protected by ownership that understands what it means to be treated fairly. And that, Marcus realized, was always the point. Before we end this powerful story of justice and accountability, let me ask you something. Have you ever witnessed discrimination like this? Have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you based on assumptions rather than facts? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like Marcus's remind us that change is possible when we refuse to accept injustice as normal. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe to Black Story Life for more powerful narratives about courage, justice, and the strength it takes to stand up for what's right. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter. And remember, sometimes the person you underestimate based on the color of their skin might be the very person who changes your life forever. Marcus Williams didn't just protect his family that day. He protected every family that would come after them. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up to discrimination, And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss stories that remind us why respect and dignity should never be negotiable. Because in the end, Richard Hayes learned the hardest way possible that character isn't determined by the power you think you have, it's revealed by how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. And Marcus Williams, he was always watching.